American soldiers once believed the B-52 Stratofortress was unstoppable, a flying fortress that could turn any target into ash. They joked that when the bombers passed overhead, nothing below would ever move again. But in the jungles of Vietnam, that confidence shattered. Entire squadrons released their payloads, hundreds of bombs, each capable of leveling a city block. And yet, when the smoke cleared, entire villages still stood. The earth trembled, the sky burned, but the people beneath simply vanished, only to reappear moments later from tunnels the Americans didn't even know existed. Some soldiers said it felt like the jungle itself had swallowed the explosions whole. For the first time, U.S. troops realized that even the most advanced technology on Earth could be outsmarted by mud, darkness, and silence. To understand how it happened, we have to go back to the early days of the Vietnam War. By the mid-1960s, the Vietnam War had transformed from a local conflict into one of the most complex and brutal wars of the 20th century. The United States, confident in its unmatched air power, believed it could crush North Vietnam through precision and overwhelming force. The jungles, mountains, and rice fields below seemed insignificant compared to the might of the U.S. Air Force. The logic was simple. If the enemy hides, destroy the ground they hide under. At the center of this belief was the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, a machine born during the Cold War designed to carry nuclear weapons across continents. To American commanders, deploying it over Vietnam meant bringing godlike destruction to the battlefield. Each bomber could carry up to 30 tons of explosives, flattening an area the size of a small town in minutes. To the generals in Saigon, it was a perfect weapon against an enemy that refused to fight in the open. The first B-52 raids began in 1965 under Operation Rolling Thunder. The goal was simple: bomb the North into submission and cut off the flow of troops and supplies heading south. From high above the clouds, the bombers would fly in perfect formation, invisible to ground fire. Their bombs fell in long, relentless waves. The earth convulsed, the jungle burned, and shockwaves rolled for miles. On maps and in planning rooms, it looked perfect. But on the ground, reality was far different. Vietnam was not a flat battlefield. It was a living labyrinth of rivers, swamps, dense jungle, and mountains that swallowed entire armies. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces had spent years mastering the land. They knew how to vanish within seconds, how to move without leaving a trail, how to turn the earth itself into armor. To them, American bombs were terrifying but predictable. Every sound of an engine above gave them time to disappear underground, into tunnels carved deep beneath villages and forests. Meanwhile, American troops on the ground watched with awe and unease as B-52 strikes painted the horizon with fire. The shockwaves could be felt miles away. Windows shattered, ears rang, the very air seemed to tear apart. Yet when soldiers advanced toward the impact zones, they often found something unsettling. Amid endless craters and burned trees, small huts still stood. Narrow footpaths led into nothingness, and sometimes within hours, the same villages would return to life as if nothing had happened. Intelligence officers were baffled. Reports showed thousands of bombs dropped, yet enemy casualties were low. Photographs taken after missions revealed the same haunting image: destruction everywhere, except where the Viet Cong actually were. Some American analysts began to question if their maps were wrong. Others blamed faulty targeting equipment. But those who had walked the bombed villages knew the truth was far stranger. The Vietnamese had turned the jungle into a shield. Beneath the surface lay vast tunnel systems, command centers, hospitals, weapon caches, and escape routes that stretched for miles. They could survive the heaviest bombardments, wait until the planes passed, then emerge to fight again. Every crater, every bombed-out hill became part of their defense. Still, Washington insisted that victory was only a matter of time. More bombs, more pressure, more destruction. That was the solution. Between 1965 and 1968, the U.S. dropped over 1 million tons of explosives on Vietnam, more than all bombs used in World War II by all sides combined. Each mission was meant to break the enemy's will, but instead it hardened it. As the war dragged on, something began to shift. The soldiers on the ground started losing faith in the air power that was supposed to protect them. They had seen too many missions where the B-52s thundered overhead, and yet, days later, ambushes struck from the very same villages that were supposed to have been erased. The myth of American invincibility began to crack, replaced by confusion, fear, and an unspoken question that haunted every man who saw those bombed-out fields. How could so much power miss so completely? To the American military, the B-52 represented the pinnacle of strategic warfare, a flying symbol of industrial and technological dominance. It had been designed not for jungle warfare, but for nuclear apocalypse. Yet, in Vietnam, generals tried to use it like a giant hammer to crush a swarm of ghosts. Each mission began hundreds of miles away, on the island of Guam or in Thailand. Dozens of crews climbed into the colossal bombers, their cargo bays filled with strings of 500 and 750-pound bombs. The takeoff alone shook the ground, 6 engines roaring, black smoke trailing for miles. Once in the air, they climbed to an altitude of 30,000 feet, high above the weather, far beyond the reach of small arms fire or anti-aircraft guns. From that height, the pilots could not see the jungle, the villages, or the people below. They followed coordinates, not landscapes. American engineers had developed an intricate system called box bombing. Radar operators in a lead aircraft guided the entire formation to a target box, usually an area 1 to 2 miles wide. At the right second, computers released hundreds of bombs in perfect sequence. To anyone watching from below, it looked like the sky itself was collapsing. The pattern was called carpet bombing, and its purpose was total annihilation. But Vietnam was not a grid of cities. It was chaos, tangled forests, uneven terrain, shifting weather. Radar signals bent off mountains, monsoon clouds swallowed aircraft, and coordinates often drifted miles off course. Even a small miscalculation meant the entire strike could land in the wrong valley. And that happened far more often than anyone in Washington wanted to admit. Operation Arclight, launched in 1965, was supposed to demonstrate the sheer terror of American air power. B-52s targeted suspected Viet Cong bases, supply routes, and even villages accused of harboring guerrillas. Early reports spoke of devastating results: forests flattened, craters everywhere. But when reconnaissance teams went to inspect the damage, they found only silence. The enemy was gone. That's when intelligence officers began to realize something extraordinary. The Vietnamese were listening. Every bomber formation produced a unique radio signature and engine sound that could be heard from dozens of miles away. Peasants, soldiers, even children learned to recognize it. Whenever the distant rumble echoed through the jungle, it became a signal, a warning that death was minutes away. Within seconds, villagers disappeared underground into networks of tunnels, trenches, and reinforced bunkers. These tunnels were not random holes in the earth. They were entire underground cities. Some stretched over 200 kilometers with multiple levels, ventilation shafts, meeting rooms, kitchens, and hospitals. The most famous were the Cu Chi tunnels near Saigon, a maze so dense that even when Americans discovered them, clearing them was nearly impossible. Bombs could collapse entrances, but the deeper chambers survived, and every crater from a B-52 strike became new material for fortification. The broken earth turned into walls, the mud into cover. American troops who advanced after a strike often found eerie scenes. Trees stripped bare, animals burned, but no bodies. The smell of gunpowder lingered, but the enemy was nowhere. Then hours later, sniper fire would erupt from the very same area. It was psychological warfare, a ghost war. By 1967, frustration grew inside the U.S. military. Generals demanded more precision, more power. Engineers responded with new radar systems and improved bombing algorithms, but the fundamental problem remained. They were fighting a hidden enemy on a shifting battlefield. In the north, the B-52s targeted the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a vast supply network running through Laos and Cambodia. The campaign dropped millions of tons of bombs, turning entire regions into moonscapes. Yet the supplies kept flowing. For every bridge destroyed, a new one appeared overnight. Even pilots began to doubt. Many confessed that they never actually saw their targets. "We were bombing coordinates," one crewman recalled. "We had no idea who was down there." On the ground, soldiers described advancing into bombed zones that looked like the surface of another planet, pitted, gray, silent, and then being ambushed by Viet Cong fighters emerging from hidden entrances. Some American advisors proposed using ground sensors, infrared detectors, even chemical defoliants to expose tunnel networks. That led to Operation Ranch Hand, the spraying of Agent Orange, and to specialized tunnel rat units sent to explore underground systems. But for every new tactic, the Vietnamese adapted. They dug deeper, created false entrances, and used bamboo ventilation shafts that were invisible from above. The paradox grew clearer. The more bombs America dropped, the stronger the enemy seemed to become. Every strike forced civilians and fighters alike to move underground, uniting them in survival. The destruction of villages didn't break morale, it hardened it. "We feared the sky," one survivor later said, "but we learned to live beneath the earth." By 1968, when the Tet Offensive erupted, American commanders were stunned to see the scale of coordination from an enemy that was supposed to have been obliterated. Many of those attacks were planned in tunnels that had survived years of B-52 raids. The myth of air superiority had met its limit. Inside briefing rooms, officers struggled to explain how the most advanced bombing campaign in history could miss so completely. Charts showed perfect coverage patterns. Reports confirmed millions of tons dropped. Yet photographs from reconnaissance drones told a different story. Bomb lines carved into empty jungle, while enemy camps, hidden under dense canopies or inside hills, remained untouched. The Pentagon doubled down, ordering even larger bombing campaigns, Linebacker 1 and 2 during the final years of the war. Hanoi was pounded with thousands of bombs, flattening factories and neighborhoods. But by then, the world had seen the cost. The images of burned civilians and endless craters fueled global outrage. Even some American pilots called it a war against the earth itself. On the ground, soldiers no longer cheered when they heard the roar of B-52s. Many crouched and covered their ears, praying that the strikes wouldn't land on their own positions, because sometimes they did. Navigational errors, miscommunication, or bad weather occasionally caused bombs to fall short, killing American troops and allies. It was a cruel irony. The weapon meant to protect them could also destroy them. Through it all, The Vietnamese strategy never changed. They didn't need to shoot down the bombers. They only needed to outlast them. And with every missed strike, every empty crater, and every village that reappeared from the smoke, the balance of belief began to shift. The Americans still had the sky, but the Vietnamese owned the ground. December 1972. The roar of engines filled the night sky over North Vietnam. From bases in Guam and Thailand, waves of B-52s rose into the darkness, their silhouettes vanishing against the clouds. Each carried more than 27 tons of bombs, thousands of pounds of TNT, enough to erase entire city blocks in a single pass. This was Operation Linebacker II, the most concentrated aerial assault since World War II. Washington called it the Christmas bombing. The Vietnamese called it the 12 Days of Hell. Inside the lead bomber, crewmen tightened their oxygen masks. The radar screens glowed green. The pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. Bomb run in 2 minutes. Maintain formation. At 30,000 feet, the city below was invisible, buried under clouds. They couldn't see the people, the lights, or the screams that would follow. Only the steady tone of the radar told them when to open the bomb bay doors. Then came the sound, like a thunderclap that never ended. The bomb bay doors released, and hundreds of explosives tumbled into the dark. From the ground, witnesses said the sky split open. The first shockwave ripped through the air, followed by another and another, until the night became a single, endless explosion. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. The earth itself seemed to pulse, rising and falling with every blast. But amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. As the bombers turned for their second pass, North Vietnamese anti-aircraft guns opened fire with a fury no American had anticipated. Searchlights cut through the clouds, tracing beams of white across the black sky. Surface-to-air missiles, SAMs, rose in spirals of flame. The bombers' radar screens filled with alarms. In the command cabins, pilots shouted coordinates, trying to dodge invisible killers. One missile struck a B-52 head-on. The explosion was so bright it lit the entire formation. A wing tore away, the fuselage snapped, and the bomber disintegrated in midair. Parachutes blossomed like ghostly flowers against the fire. Crews and other bombers watched helplessly as the wreckage fell into the jungle below. The radio crackled. "We've lost Charcoal 1. Repeat, Charcoal 1 is down." On the ground, the city burned. The bombs tore open craters wider than swimming pools. Hospitals collapsed, schools vanished, and residential streets turned into fields of rubble. The smell of gunpowder and smoke mixed with burning wood and flesh. Civilians fled toward rivers and fields, carrying whatever they could. But even in that destruction, some neighborhoods stood untouched, shielded by hills or hidden beneath old French cellars. For reasons no one could explain, whole blocks were missed entirely, while others were wiped from existence. American soldiers stationed at bases in the South listened to radio reports with disbelief. The B-52, their invincible fortress, was being shot down. Villages that should have been erased were still fighting back. As the bombing continued night after night, the shock spread through every level of the U.S. military. In one strike near Hanoi, a formation of bombers released its entire payload over what was believed to be a major supply depot. But when reconnaissance photographs came back the next morning, analysts were stunned. The bombs had landed more than 2 miles off target. Instead of destroying military assets, they had flattened civilian housing and an empty field. The actual supply site, hidden under a camouflaged tree line, remained intact.
Pilots blamed radar interference. Commanders blamed bad weather. But intelligence officers quietly admitted the truth. The Vietnamese had learned how to fool American systems. Decoy lights, fake radar reflections, and heat signatures lured bombs away from real targets. Underground tunnels allowed troops to move safely, even as the surface exploded. Every night, when the smoke cleared, men and women emerged from the earth like shadows, repairing roads, rebuilding anti-aircraft guns, and preparing for the next wave. For the American crews, the missions became nightmares. They would take off in perfect formation, 150 planes moving as one, then return hours later missing entire squadrons. Survivors described it as flying through hell, blinding flashes, shaking metal, alarms screaming, the constant fear that the next missile had their name on it. One gunner later recalled, "You didn't see the enemy. You just watched the sky try to kill you." By the seventh night, losses mounted. Dozens of B-52s had been destroyed. Hundreds of airmen were dead or captured. Yet the orders continued. Fly again. Bomb harder. End it now.
The pressure from Washington was immense. The Nixon administration wanted to force Hanoi to the negotiation table by sheer terror. But every bomb that fell seemed to have the opposite effect. Down below, the Vietnamese people huddled in basements, temples, and tunnels. They sang to keep children calm as the ground shook. "We could feel the earth breathing," one survivor remembered. "It felt like the sky wanted to bury us." When they emerged after each raid, the streets were unrecognizable, trees uprooted, entire lakes created by impact craters, telephone poles bent like matchsticks. Yet the flag still flew over Hanoi. At the same time in the south, B-52s were still pounding suspected Viet Cong strongholds, Ben Cot, Tai Ninh, and the Iron Triangle. American ground units moved in after each strike, expecting nothing but ashes, but over and over again, they encountered a haunting pattern. Tunnels untouched, villages rebuilt, enemy fire returning from areas marked as completely destroyed. One platoon sergeant wrote in his field diary, "It's like they vanish when the bombs fall, then reappear when we arrive." Some troops started to question whether the bombing made sense at all. They watched villagers carry on with life beside massive craters, cooking rice next to unexploded ordnance. It was as if the war had split reality in two, one side of fire and noise, the other side of quiet endurance. Back in the U.S., footage from the bombings began reaching television screens. Americans saw cities reduced to dust, corpses pulled from rubble, and the endless gray wasteland left behind by the carpet bombings. Public opinion turned. Journalists asked how so much destruction could accomplish so little. The Pentagon responded with statistics. Tonnage dropped, missions completed, enemy losses estimated. But even within military circles, faith in the B-52 campaign was fading. The climax came on the final night of Linebacker 2, December 29, 1972. A massive wave of bombers took off under a blood-red sunset. This was the largest single B-52 strike in history, over 120 aircraft heading for Hanoi and Haiphong. The plan was to break North Vietnam's remaining defenses once and for all. As they crossed the coastline, anti-aircraft fire erupted like a volcano. The sky was chaos, missiles, tracer rounds, flares, explosions. Pilots couldn't tell where the ground ended and the fire began. One crew reported that the sky looked alive. In the control rooms far away, American officers listened to the radio chatter with growing dread. "Mayday, Mayday, we're hit!" Another voice cut in. "I'm losing power, ejecting now." The losses that night were among the worst of the entire war. When dawn came, the smoke still hung over the cities. Hanoi was devastated. Factories, power plants, railways, all in ruins. But even then, the Vietnamese government refused to surrender. They sent a message through diplomatic channels. "We will rebuild. You cannot bomb us into submission." In the aftermath, American reconnaissance photos revealed the bitter irony. Many of the bombs had missed their intended targets by hundreds of meters. The damage was catastrophic, but often random. Some of the most vital military installations, command centers, air defense posts, storage tunnels, were untouched. The soldiers who witnessed it firsthand would never forget the sight. They had unleashed the most powerful weapon of their time, and yet somehow the enemy endured. The jungles still stood, the tunnels still breathed. In that moment, high above the burning earth, American crews understood what the villagers below had always known all along. Power means nothing if it cannot find its target. And for all the thunder that filled the skies, Vietnam still belonged to those who could survive beneath it.
When the final echoes of the B-52s faded over Hanoi, silence fell across a land that had endured 12 days of unrelenting fire. Streets once filled with bicycles and vendors were now cratered scars of ash. Smoke drifted above shattered temples, hospitals, and schools. Yet even in that devastation, life stirred. People emerged from shelters, blinking through the haze, sweeping debris, pulling survivors from the ruins. For them, the bombing was not an ending. It was proof that survival itself was resistance. American intelligence quickly assessed the results. Over 20,000 tons of bombs had been dropped. Entire neighborhoods were flattened, but the key military command posts and storage tunnels remained functional. The Vietnamese air defenses, though battered, had downed 15 B-52s, an unthinkable blow to what had been considered an invincible fortress of the sky. For every bomber lost, 6 men either died or were captured. The shock inside the U.S. Air Force was immeasurable. The B-52 crews who returned to their bases in Guam and U Tapao stepped off the planes in silence, their uniforms stained with smoke, their eyes hollow. Reports circulated among officers. The bombing had failed to achieve its strategic purpose. North Vietnam's infrastructure was damaged, but not destroyed. The government in Hanoi still stood, its radio stations still broadcasting messages of defiance. "You can destroy our houses, but not our spirit." In Washington, the Pentagon tried to frame Linebacker 2 as a success. Charts showed tonnage, targets hit, and missions completed. But behind closed doors, senior commanders admitted that radar interference, bad weather, and clever decoys had caused massive inaccuracies. Dozens of bomb runs had missed by miles, hitting empty fields or civilian zones. The phrase "shock and awe" had turned into a grim irony. Public outrage spread throughout the United States. Photographs of burning hospitals and dead civilians filled newspapers. Protesters gathered outside the White House carrying signs that read, "Stop the Christmas bombing." Even some veterans, hardened by years of war, began to question what the campaign had accomplished. "We dropped mountains of bombs, and the enemy just kept coming out of the ground." Internationally, the political damage was severe. Allies in Europe condemned the bombing as excessive, comparing it to the destruction of Dresden. Peace talks in Paris resumed only after the campaign ended, and within weeks a ceasefire was signed. But few inside the U.S. military celebrated. They knew the truth. The campaign had exposed the limits of American power. For many soldiers who had fought in Vietnam, the realization was painful.
They had believed that technology, radar-guided bombs, jet engines, B-52 formations could force victory through sheer precision and strength. Instead, they witnessed how the Vietnamese had turned the land itself into armor. Tunnels, camouflage, and human resilience that no bomb could destroy. Villages once marked as annihilated reappeared within days, rebuilt by bare hands. Children played beside unexploded shells. Farmers returned to fields where bomb craters had become ponds. When American troops finally withdrew, the memory of those raids haunted them. Veterans described recurring dreams of explosions that never ended, of targets that never existed. The sound of the B-52 engines became a symbol of both power and futility, an echo of a war where might could not bend will. For the Vietnamese, the aftermath was both tragedy and triumph. Thousands were dead, yet the nation had survived the most concentrated bombing campaign in history. Survivors later recalled that each night under the bombs felt like standing on the edge of the world, but every sunrise was a victory. Decades later, craters from those raids still scar the countryside, filled with water and lilies. Children fish in them, unaware that those small ponds were once the epicenters of destruction. The war ended, but the earth remembers. In the end, Operation Linebacker II taught a lesson written not in military textbooks, but in human endurance.
In the end, the B-52 bombings became more than a military operation. They became a symbol of the limits of power. The Americans had unleashed one of the most devastating air assaults in human history. But what they could not destroy was the will of a nation that refused to bow. The villages they thought erased rose again from the ashes. The tunnels remained, the people endured, and the jungle swallowed the craters like the earth reclaiming its wounds. For many who witnessed it, the sound of a B-52 still echoes decades later, a low, distant thunder that reminds them how fragile superiority can be. Technology had promised control, precision, and dominance, but Vietnam showed that war is never just fought with machines. It's fought with patience, endurance, and faith. Even now, fragments of those bombs lie buried beneath the soil, silent relics of a war that proved one timeless truth. You can burn the land, but not the spirit of those who defend it. As the smoke faded and peace returned, the world was left with a haunting question. If the most powerful nation on earth could not force victory from the sky, then what truly defines strength in war? Next, we'll explore the weapon that became both America's lifeline and its heartbreak. The helicopter that carried soldiers into the jungle and sometimes never brought them back.